there's a question there. King David wasn't able to build the temple because he was an Ish Milchama. We said before how is that really what God told him? In the books of the prophets, it's not mentioned why God did not allow David to build a temple, even though it was his idea, and God gave him the credit for it. They said, no, you can't do it. Later in the book of Chronicles, which is not Navi, it's Governor Melch himself declares that that was God's reason. Now, many read it and say, yes, Governor Melch wouldn't lie. He was also somewhat of Navi. So there you go. It must have been that was the reason. It just had not been included in the book of Samuel, and it wasn't included in the Tehillim even. It wasn't included in the book of Kings, but that was the underlying reason. But then we have to say, fine, if we assume that was the reason, we also have to point out that that reason is not universal. That is, God wouldn't say, oh, because you have a Jewish leader or a Jewish king or whoever has engaged in much war and spilled much blood of the enemy, just much blood of the enemy, so he is not deserving or he should not build the temple. That is incorrect. Our greatest leaders were all great shedders of blood also on behalf of Am Yisrael, and they were still given the opportunity to build a sanctuary. Moshe Rabbeinu made war before the Exodus and years after the Exodus, up until the day he died. He was capable of doing so. God just forbade him. And he conquered parts of what eventually became Eretz Yisrael on behalf of the Jewish people. That's the Transjordan. Yet Moses was given the privilege of overseeing the construction of the very first sanctuary. Joshua himself, also, our prototypical king, conquered the land of Israel and made much more and killed many Rishayim. Yet he was also granted the opportunity to set up the sanctuary at Shiloh, which was the first temple, technically speaking, and it stood for hundreds of years. And God didn't say, Joshua, you've spilled too much blood. Now we're going to have to wait a generation for, I don't know, Osniel ben Kenaz, and even he went out and made war eventually, for some other Jewish leader to arise to be a man of peace, and let him set the sanctuary up in its semi-permanent location in Shiloh. That was never such a thing. And God didn't deprive other Jewish kings who made war later. For example, Yehuda Maccabi, and everybody mentioned in Sefer Melachim, they had great wars and they killed many of the enemy, yet they also did stuff to improve the temple. So that wasn't I guess a limiting factor. The Rambam himself writes that you'll know he's the Mashiach because he fights God's wars and then he succeeds in building a temple. And we don't say, no, if he fights wars, we should then let his son take over and build a temple. So we're actually at a loss to explain why it is for King David particularly, this was said, because he had fought many wars and shed blood, that he was disqualified by God from building a temple, whereas others were not. Just as we saw before, King Saul was the one who was told not to take spoils from the Amalekites, but twice we saw that King David took spoils from the Amalekites and dedicated them to the temple. So what David did was fine. Saul was told not to. Why was Saul specifically told to take no spoils from the Amalekites? I don't know. I wasn't there, but that's what the Navi told him. So there is what to say. I saw one proposed answer was that King David brought about the death of too many Jews. Okay? Joshua and Moses and others did not bring about the death of Jews in battle, or they say they even could somehow be at fault for bringing about the deaths that were totally not theirs. For example, King David, you could say it was technically his fault that Saul wiped out the city of Kohanim, Nov. So perhaps that was on David's ledger to his discredit. So maybe divine justice assumed that. But I don't know. I don't think there's a conclusive answer. All I did want to point out is just because you have a Jewish leader who is a man of war and has spilled much enemy blood, it doesn't disqualify him from building the temple. And on the contrary, perhaps it's even a good sign that he deserves to do it. And if you'll give the David precedent, we can't do anything. We can't actually use that as a precedent because that's an exception. It's a prophetic exception.